Hello, and welcome to another edition of Hamblin Vision in Conversation. And joining me today is Patricia Godden. For those of you who are Hamblin Vision members, or if you are a regular reader of our website, you'll no doubt have come across Patricia's astrological updates. So I'm really pleased to welcome Patricia to this conversation today. And no surprise, we're going to be talking about astrology. So Patricia, welcome. It's lovely to see you.
Thank you, Mike, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be able to talk to people.
Our YouTube channel gets the most views on certain videos at around the times of key astrological dates. So I think that whereas once upon a time astrology might have been thought of as something a bit too esoteric for some people, I think it more and more it's become part of the way that people navigate through their month, through their year. So, for example, the summer solstice, we see a huge increase in viewings of certain videos. But first of all, Patricia, I'd like to welcome you to this conversation. And for those who perhaps don't know so much about your work and your background in this area, I was fascinated to read on your website about your previous career. Was it as a biochemist? Is that your...
That was my very first career. My first degree was physiology and biochemistry. And then I did research on endocrinology, the study of hormones.
Yeah.
And that's what my doctorate was in. And then I did a lot of postdoc research on hormones and then went into a little bit of cancer research.
Mm-hmm.
And then I worked for the pharmaceutical industry eventually. So I had to, all my scientific life, I had to absolutely prove every statement I wrote, particularly when I was in the pharmaceutical industry. I had to show reports that proved what I was writing in reports that were going to health authorities.
Mm.
And that is totally different from astrology, which is quite literally off this planet.
Yes, indeed.
And I can see in my own horoscope, I'm not going to disclose my own horoscope, but I can see in my own horoscope how I can move from one to the other. And I think it's also a personal development. I think a lot of people come into life with certain things they need to do in their lives. And then it's almost as if when they've done all that they've needed to do, they move into what's almost coming from within them to be able to develop. And in my case, that was initially reflexology. I was a reflexologist for about 7 years. And then I moved into astrology, and it lights my fire now. It's everything I do.
It's fabulous because I think that a lot of the criticism that I've heard about astrology over the years is that it's not scientific enough, it's not empirical enough, and all these sorts of things. So I love the fact that you come from that background and you bring perhaps a certain rigor and yeah, seriousness is kind of the word I want to use that we don't always see in just in the presentation of certain types of astrology. So I think that's fantastic and encouraging. And I don't know much about the history of this, but I'm sure I've heard it may have been from another astrologer actually, who's UK based, talking about the scientific mathematical minds of many centuries ago, where astrology in a different part of history would have been seen as a very scientific art, a scientific practice. So the early mathematicians have I heard somewhere that the three wise men, if they were to have, if we take that as a literal story, would have been astrologers?
It's quite likely in those days a lot of the sages and the wise people were astrologers. But it's worth remembering that up until about the 17th, 18th century, astrology and astronomy were practiced by the same person.
Right.
And I think when we look at the astronomy, that is the science. That is, you can't question that a planet is in a particular part of the sky. That's the science. How you interpret that is the astrology. And that is when astronomy, about the 17th, 18th century, astronomy and astrology went their separate ways, when people were either going down the scientific line or down the more interpretive line.
Yes, brilliant. So perhaps, so the first question I had that I really wanted to ask you might be appropriate at this time, since we've just talked about your previous career. So what do you think it was that led to that switch, that led to you to be interested in astrology?
Well, at a deep and profound level, it was probably part of my soul wanting to move on into other subjects. But at a very down-to-earth and practical level, it was a time of great change in my life. And I've always believed that there are 4 components in life that need to be balanced: physical, mental, emotional, spiritual. And I had plenty going on all 3. Apart from mental, I didn't basically have enough to keep my brain active. And then a flyer came through the door from the White Eagle School of Astrology. And I looked at it, and in my simplicity, I thought, oh, yes, well, the White Eagle School, that will involve meditation. And doesn't astrology involve geometry? And I loved geometry at school. I absolutely loved it. And I thought, oh, well, maybe this will keep my brain busy learning about astrology in both using meditation and using geometry. And that it was that simple. Lovely. So I took up astrology to keep my head busy. I didn't realize that 3.5 years later, I'd be professionally qualified. And in due course after that, I've written 3 books on astrology now, and I teach it.
Fantastic. And also,
so that was quite an opening for me, and very much, well, if you follow your heart, where it can actually lead you. I didn't know. If somebody had said, oh, you'll be a professional astrologer, when I first answered that flyer, oh, well, pigs might fly.
But also it sounds like you chose something that, you know, that was very much in your interests. It's not like you chose to study Mandarin in order to keep your brain alive. You know, you've actually chosen something that was already, like you say, you were following your heart. You loved geometry, wanted to do more in the meditative realm and spiritual work, and you'd been doing a healing kind of work with reflexology anyway, which seems like a natural stepping stone from the ultimately healing work of providing, you know, medical research. So yeah, it does sound divinely orchestrated, one might say. Like you said, it's in the plan. So my next question then, I'm going to have to remind myself by looking at my list, just a little list of questions. So yeah, so here it is. So this is a big one. I think this could lead to lots of reflections and perhaps information for our viewers. But so the question is, how would you suggest that people, just the general population, anyone watching this, how would you suggest that people make use of astrology?
There are probably as many ways as there are people, because each person needs something different. A lot of the people come to me when they are going through a very challenging time in their life. And they're quite often seeking a deeper reason as to why those challenges are going on. Now, I can look at their horoscope if they have got an accurate time of birth. Very important to have an accurate time of birth. I can look at their horoscope and get some idea of what they and their soul might be trying to learn through these challenges. And that, for a lot of people, can be very helpful to know that the difficulties they're going through have got a reason. There's going to be a benefit to them in the end. We've all been through challenges. We've all gone through some very testing times. And if we knew that there was a reason, maybe a philosophical reason, but a reason why we're going through this, then we can almost work with it. We can think, okay, so I'm learning this lesson. Almost, what can I do to promote the learning of that lesson? So that is one reason. Now, astrology, I do not do predictive work. I was trained to do it. It's part of the course that I did. But I believe that if there is a really good reading of the natal horoscope, then I would prefer to empower a person to make their own decisions rather than saying you will do this, that, or the other. No person can say to anybody else, do this, that, or the other. And I would never even dream of doing it. But I really feel that by understanding themselves more through a very thorough and deep reading, they are more empowered to make their own decisions. So that is the basis of my work. If somebody is going through a very challenging situation and they do have a very accurate birth time, it is possible to see how long that challenging situation will go on for. And if we know it's going to go on for a day, a week, a month, 6 months, we know it's coming to an end. Now, when we look at any situation, anything comes to an end. All things come to an end. The good things, the challenging things, they all come to an end. But when we're going through something that's really difficult for us, if we've got even if we're just told it will come to an end, it can give hope so that people can go on. So that is perhaps the greatest use that I make of astrology. A, helping people to understand themselves better so they can make their own decisions. And B, if they're in difficult situations and they've got an accurate birth time, then giving them some idea of when that time might come to an end and what they're learning through it. Now, there are other types of astrology which I've studied, but they are not my specialisms. For instance, horary astrology. If a person has a particular question, you can ask a horary astrologer, and that horary astrologer will give an answer. There is a branch of astrology that specializes in financial astrology. Again, that's something I do not do, but people work with that. There's a branch of astrology that looks at medical astrology. Well, I think there you have to be well up in medical understanding to even contemplate doing that. Although I've worked in the healthcare industry for a large part of my life, I do not do medical astrology. And then we can look at world events. Just as people have horoscopes, nations have horoscopes. And it's very interesting looking at what, at a soul level of a nation, they can be learning from other nations. So I think those are the main areas of astrology.
I think that's fascinating and very, very helpful, I think, for quite a lot of viewers. I mean, there will be some people watching this who will have been aware of some of those fields, but I think a lot of people think of astrology as the more predictive type that you mentioned initially, that seeks to sort of point a direction that something of this sort of nature is going to happen, or there'll be an opportunity for this, and look out for examples of, or look out for opportunities of a certain kind in the houses, for example, certain areas of our life. But I think it's really interesting to look at the wider pictures of how astrology can help us. And I was particularly interested in when you talk about nations and also groups. I know that for the Hamblin Vision, you have sometimes done an astrological reading for us as a charitable trust, looking at when the trust was set up in 1960 and taking into account the position of the planets then. And I think that's really interesting, perhaps a field that people don't know so much about, that you can look at astrology for a group, or like you say, a country, a nation. That's fascinating.
Yes, you can look at the astrology of companies. If you know the date that the Constitution was written, then you can look at companies, you can look at organizations, even little local groups. People can look if they know when somebody first said, oh, let's form a group, then you can look at the horoscope of that group.
I've always had an interest in astrology, but I've become particularly interested in it since the pandemic, actually. And I have to give credit to, her name is Pam Gregory. Yeah, Pam Gregory. And the thing that was fascinating to me was her observation, and I'm sure I'll get some of this wrong, but just a general just sharing of information that she was giving about the different dates in history at times that big pandemics or disease plagues, big outbreaks of disease had occurred in the past, that there was a very similar, obviously not exactly the same, but very similar configuration of planets at similar times, actually. And I found that staggeringly interesting.
Looking at those longer cycles is really, really interesting. At the beginning of the pandemic, we had a lineup of planets that we actually hadn't had that lineup since 3838 BC.
Gosh.
So we're looking at nearly 6,000 years ago.
Right.
And you think, well, how did the world change then?
Yeah.
And the world's changed hugely with the COVID pandemic as well. And this is one of the things that astrologers use, because I never set out to prove astrology. You can't prove something that's as big as the solar system or even bigger. But we can look at repeat patterns. And we can think, oh, well, the last time that happened, such and such a thing happened. And then draw on associations in that way. And that is what most of astrology is on. Astrology has been around for thousands of years. And so we know that when there's this interaction of planets, this type of event will happen. We can't say exactly what, but we can say it'll be in the area of, or for instance, in the COVID pandemic, we knew there was going to be something big happening. We didn't know what.
Yeah, fascinating. There was also something else I wanted to draw attention to from that kind of approach, like the longer view. And before we began the recording, we were talking about astrology applied to the soul's journey, like the journey of an individual soul. And I know that is it your third book that is called Seeking the Soul? And I think I'm right in saying that's based on Draconian meditations related to...
Yes, it is. During part of the course that I studied, there was a lesson on Draconic astrology. And I became very interested in it. I wanted to know more. And there's very little. There's one main text on Draconic astrology. I wanted to know more. And if I'm wanting to know more about a subject, sometimes I will meditate on it. And I meditated on every planet over a course of quite a lot of time. I meditated on every planet and on every sign of the zodiac. And this is going back over 10 years. And I made detailed notes and I painted what I saw in the meditations, because quite often a picture, well, there's the expression, the picture can say 1,000 words.
Yes.
And then it was only 2 or 3 years ago that I thought, I've got to get this information out into the world. So I published the book called Seeking the Soul, because Draconic astrology is looking at the soul's impulses.
Right.
And there's short descriptions of the meditations and then a picture that portrays it. And I've used Draconic astrology as well as the regular, what's called tropical astrology, in most of my consultations. And funnily enough, a lot of people will say that's the bit that interests them the most, is looking at what their soul is striving to do and how it's tackling it.
And so that's worth pausing there to make the point that people can come to you for an individual consultation, that you can work one-to-one with people.
Absolutely. And they can contact me via my website, patriciagodden.com. So it's very easy, and they will see more of what I do and they'll see my books there. So that might be the way. And then people can think about it in their own time. Because it's quite a decision to take, to have a reading done.
Yes, I know. I've had at least 2 friends that I know of, both of whom actually live in North Yorkshire, but they've both separately been to different astrologers for quite full, detailed readings and then follow-up, consultations. And both of those people have said that they were life-changing. And interestingly, when you mentioned your own beginnings in astrology happened at a time of a big change in your life. For those two people for whom the consultations were really, really powerful, they were also going through big life changes, some to do with relationships, some to do with work, some to do with health. So I think that's worth noting as well, that at times of change, whether it's stressful or just really big and challenging and intense, that all of these different practical applications, of spiritual practice really, can be very helpful.
I absolutely agree. And to me, astrology is a tool that some people will have in their toolbox. They'll have other tools. They might have therapy. They might be more based at a physical level and go to the gym more. So each person has got their own tools that help them in their lives. And astrology is just one of the many tools that people can use. And of course, nowadays, with the internet and with incredible software for astrology, you can get your own horoscope up on your phone. It's that simple. How you interpret it might be another thing. And different astrologers will always give a slightly different variation when interpreting the same horoscope, depending on their own training and experience. My training is more from a spiritual background, so that is in when I am giving a reading.
Fantastic. That's really great. So the very last question then, and this one might be a brief one because you may have a very succinct answer to it. These conversations we're often discussing around the theme of practical spirituality. And as you know, and some people watching may also know, but if they don't, Henry Thomas Hamblin, the writer, whose work we as a trust are responsible for preserving his spiritual teachings. He was concerned very much with practical application of spiritual insight, spiritual understanding, but also of what we might discover in times of meditation or changing our thoughts to see how that affects the outcomes we get in life. So the question I tend to ask most people on these little video conversations is, if there was one thing that you would advise people to practice in a practical way in their life to be a spiritual practice, what one thing, because as we've just been saying, there are so many different approaches that we can choose. But if you had to say to a person who was interested in perhaps maybe widening that area of their life, you talked about those 4 parts of our life: the spiritual, the mental, the emotional, and the physical. What would you say to a person, the one thing that you might suggest if they want to expand that spiritual practice area of their life?
I found it very difficult to try and think of one thing. And in the end, I came up with several things. Excuse me. I think it's very important for a person to be true to themselves. And this might be the Pinocchio, the conscience, whatever. But if you're true to yourself, there's an expression, be true to yourself and you're true to all others. So even if other people don't like your decision, as long as it is done with kindness and it is what you feel is right for you, I think sticking with what you feel is right to you. But it must be done with kindness and consideration for other people. Now, another thing which I think is important for people is to be able to listen to themselves. Well, that partly leads on to knowing what is right for for a person, for themselves, and quiet time. For some people, it might be meditation. For some people, it might be walking the dog. Just time when you can be alone with your own thoughts. Because so many people lead very busy lives and they don't have time to take stock.
Mm.
What's in my life? What do I want to continue doing? What has actually passed its sell-by date and I now need to give up? And those decisions are really fundamental.
But I think the way you've expressed that is really, actually, for me personally, that's in a way, it's saying what I would want to communicate, which is, it doesn't have to be, because meditation is such a loaded word for some people that it comes with lots of connotations that just don't feel right. But actually, take time for yourself, quiet time, take stock, look at what's working, think about what you want and where you're going. You know, I think that's really good. Just like you say, go for a walk, spend time with yourself, be kind to yourself and to others. I think that's brilliant advice.
That actually leads on to the third point. I knew there was a third point. To love what's going on in life and to love yourself. When we have difficulties, it's very easy to try and put blame on one person or one thing, or we beat ourselves up because we're not good enough to be able to just ride the waves of a rocky life. But I have seen so many times when, if I've been able to just send the people or the situation that I might be having difficulty with love, just pure love, and to send love to myself, I will feel much better about it. And it's surprising how the situation can then gradually change. I've seen that in many different instances in my life. And it all comes down to just love, which can be at times challenging. And at times it can be so simple. It doesn't mean to say that we condone whatever's going on. Of course not. But we can send love to the whole situation, even globally. Send love, send light, even to the whole situation. And we can feel better by doing that, because we can feel as if we're doing something that might help.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I think that's fantastic advice. It's hard because I think you're right. Sometimes people will assume that to send love to something means to say that we're approving of it, we like it, we have a preference for it. But it's not that quality of love we're talking about. It's a greater universal sense of openness, really. And I think you're right. I think that sometimes that can lead to standing up to a bully. It's not always passive. Loving a situation, giving it what it, in a way, listening to it, you know, giving it care like a mother does to a child. Sometimes it means something that's not passive, that is actually active and can help others in a greater way too.
Very much so. Yes, it can be difficult, but it can be done.
I agree.
And it can leave us feeling better in ourselves.
Patricia, it's been such a lovely, oh, thank you. It's been lovely to talk and to share with you about your work and astrology. And I'm certain that many people watching this will find it enlightening and interesting and a good resource. So if anybody watching would like to learn more about Patricia's work, we mentioned in the interview earlier, you can visit her website at patriciagodden.com. And you can also read on the Hamblin Vision website the astrological updates that we have very regularly. In fact, another one I think will be going up this week, I'm pretty sure, but certainly by Thursday, when we'll be sending out some email updates for you all. But thanks everybody for watching, and thank you again, Patricia. It was lovely to talk, and yeah, hope to speak to you soon.
Thank you, Mike, and I wish all the best for all the people who watch this YouTube in due course.
Thank you. Thank you so much.